Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillahi wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man walah. Amma ba'd. Today's talk is, in my opinion, one of the most important topics that each and every one of us needs to be thinking about. In fact, I think it's not a secret that the greatest, or in fact one of the greatest, if not the greatest problem that we in the West here as Muslims face, the one underlying issue and question that almost all other controversies revolve around, is the issue of applying Islamic theology and Islamic law to our modern lives in our modern context. In other words, how do we live our lives based upon the teachings of our religion that go back almost 14 centuries, even as we live in the 21st century, in a democracy, in a society that espouses humanistic and liberal values, and hence is radically different from any Muslim majority society in the world today? To what level, to what extent are we allowed to conform to the dominant culture and the values around us? And where must we draw the line and simply refuse to budge? This is really the question that every one of us, every intelligent practicing Muslim should be asking, should be thinking about. And just to give you one controversial example, and I'm just giving it as an example, so don't get emotional, just think about the example rather than the fiqh of it. Look at the controversy that erupted over the Happy Muslim video that was done, was it 5-6 months ago, right? Forget the issue of whether my opinion is haram or halal. I'm talking about the controversy that it generated, right? The heated discussions, the emotions that came. A lot of Muslims were not too happy about the Happy Muslims video. And a lot of Muslims were happy, and they said, what's wrong with this? And the point is not, again, right now at least, to talk about the fiqh and the legal. The point is, it is symptomatic. It is emblematic of a far bigger problem, and that is, to what level can we conform? If we do what some of the people in that video did, is this conforming that is halal, or is this conforming that is not halal? And so really this is the crux of the question. And inshallah ta'ala, I'm going to begin my rather long talk. I have almost an hour or more actually today. I want to begin this talk by a rather lengthy fable, if you like. An imaginary scenario. It is a fable, but to be honest, it's not too implausible. The imagery that I've chosen and the situation I've chosen could actually very well be imaginable in a few decades from now. So I'm going to begin this long talk with maybe a 25-minute fable, and then we will go back and analyze the fable from our modern perspective. Imagine, if you will, in a land not too far away, in the near distant future, a country called the United Kingdom of Veganopolis, UKV for short. The people of this land are firm vegans. They believe that eating meat and all meat-derived products is barbaric. It is cruel. That killing animals is symptomatic of bloodthirsty tendencies. That there's so much wrong, inherently wrong, with rearing animals only for the sake of, quote-unquote, murdering them for their hides or for their skin or for their meat or for any other benefit. And they quite literally view themselves as being the single most progressive society that mankind has ever seen in its history. Why? Because we are a society that has abandoned the age-old practice of eating meat. And therefore, this gives them a sense of, frankly, arrogance when they look at cultures and society where people still eat meat. They look at these cultures with disdain, with contempt. How can you be so cruel, so backward, so savage as to actually kill an animal, have all that blood come out, and then you eat that meat of that animal? Surely this is the sign of being very backward and very uncivilized. In fact, the foreign policy of this land, UKV, the foreign policy was actually based upon, frankly, imposing this value upon other countries. They felt so strongly about this value that they would dictate friendly relations with other lands that were vegan. And they would impose sanctions, Maybe even, in fact, they would invade other lands with the goal of, or at least that's what they would tell their public, that we want to spread veganism amongst these backward people. Because these people are still eating meat. And we are a culture and society that has now advanced to being vegans. Surely these other lands will appreciate, and we will be welcomed by their intellectual thinkers and their enlightened members as we spread veganism down their throats, quite literally, the pun is intended, as we go and spread veganism in their lands. And frankly, the tale is imaginary, but it's not too far-fetched, because there are lots of people in our times that are becoming more green conscious, more animal rights and whatnot, and the vegan movement is indeed growing. Now, imagine in our fable, this United Kingdom of Veganopolis, large groups of Muslims came here and immigrated here from various parts of the Muslim world, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Egypt, Timbuktu. They all came from their own lands. Perhaps initially they might have come as laborers or whatnot, but their children and their children after them were completely comfortable living in these lands. They spoke the same language, they studied at the same institutions, they imbibed much of the ethos and the spirit and the environment and the culture of this United Kingdom of Veganopolis. Now the question arises, Muslim cultures are not vegan. And these Muslim immigrants, when they came here, clearly they have attitudes towards vegetarianism and eating meat that are not in conformity with the dominant culture. So what do you think the Muslims of UKV, how would they react to this dominant culture of veganism? You guys following the plot so far? Right? Simple enough so far, right? Okay, you might want to take notes from now on, because now we're going to go into specific examples, for those of you who are so inclined to do. How do you think the Muslims would react to this new phenomenon? The phenomenon of being vegan that is clearly not emanating from the lands of Islam, but is founded, is very popular in UKV. We can safely assume that the Muslims would not have one particular response. Rather, there would be a variety of responses, right? We can safely assume there wouldn't be one Muslim response, but rather multiple Muslim responses. So, for simplicity's sake, in today's fable, I'll talk about 5 trends, 5 very reasonable responses that we will expect from the 3rd, 4th, 5th generation of Muslims living in the United Kingdom. Oh, United Kingdom of Veganopolis, excuse me. Living in the United, it's imaginary, don't ever think it's real here. The United Kingdom of Veganopolis, right? We can imagine 5 distinct trends. There could be more, but for the purposes of this talk, there are more. For the purposes of this talk, I will just elaborate on 5. The first response, no doubt, some groups of Muslims, having been born in this ethos of veganism, would be so convinced that veganism is the only morally acceptable lifestyle, and they see that their tradition of Islam clearly teaches the permissibility of eating animals, that they have no other option but to assimilate completely into the dominant culture and abandon the culture and religion of their forefathers. So this group literally embraces the status quo and considers the spirit and the ethos and the culture of the dominant society of UKV to be correct, and understands that its religion is not in conformity with those values. And so they say that I cannot remain a Muslim, and I have to basically become a part of this dominant culture. Many of them do so quietly. They just ignore the teachings of Islam, stop coming to the masjid, and you just hear about them here and there that, oh, so-and-so, you know, he's just left practicing Islam, and they just become a part and parcel of the culture. Some of them, of course, they become famous online in the media because they start criticizing their culture of the parents, and they become critics of Islam. And they would say, I was born a Muslim, my family ate meat, but I no longer can be a Muslim. And let us imagine, what would such a person say? Such a person would say, and he would become famous and rich, having books being printed, being interviewed on television, because he is portraying the dominant culture as being correct, and he is publicly professing, I've left the culture and religion of my forefathers. So he becomes a poster child, a darling boy for the media. They love these types of people. So we can imagine this person becoming rich and famous by criticizing his ex-Muslim, family and friends and whatnot. What would he say? Such a person would say that he studied the Quran and Sunnah, and that clearly the Quran allows for the eating of meat. There's no question about it. He'll quote verses that Allah says in the Quran, وَأُحِلَّتْ لَكُمُ الْأَنْعَامِ, that all cattle are allowed for you. And he might even quote verses and put a sinister meaning amongst them, sinister meaning upon them. A verse that is very innocent, very innocuous, but he'll read in symbolism and prejudices where they simply do not exist. There is a dramatization about a very innocent verse that is simply surreal. For example, he might say, the Quran actually encourages the lining up of animals ready to be slaughtered. And in fact, there is a verse in the Quran, وَاذْكُرُوا اسْمَ اللَّهِ عَلَيْهَا صَوَافَ فَإِذَا وَجَبَ جُنُوبُهَا. So Allah is saying, line up the animals, this is in the Quran, it's a real verse in the Quran, and so that you may mention the name of Allah. Then when these animals fall after they have been slaughtered, then thank Allah and distribute it to the poor and whatnot. But he will say, for example, the Quran publicly, clearly encourages that animals should be lined up one after the other and slaughtered en masse, one after the other. And he would be technically correct because that is what the Quran is saying. But the dramatization and the new symbolism that is simply absent in the mind, this symbolism would be permitted by the dominant culture because from their perspective, this is barbaric. To line up animals and slaughter them en masse. From their perspective, this is how they have been reared. And he will also say, I read the life of our Prophet, or their Prophet because he's no longer a Muslim. I read the life of the Prophet and it was clear, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and it was clear that he was a meat-eating human being. In fact, we learn in one of their textbooks, the Sahih al-Bukhari, that the favorite dish of the Prophet was what? What was it? The shank of a lamb. So he will say, how could a prophet who is truly divine, his favorite dish is meat? How can this be? Clearly, this prophet cannot be from God. That's what he would say, right? Don't misquote me, astaghfirullah. I'm just quoting his kufr so that we understand this kufr, right? And he would say, the religion of Islam encourages the slaughter of animals. In fact, their festivals center around what? What is Eid al-Adha? Their festivals are nothing other than slaughtering tens of thousands of sheep and goats are killed. And this is a festival. And anytime something joyous happens, a child is born, aqiqah, right? Or a marriage takes place, walima. What does the religion tell them to do? Go slaughter and kill a goat and cow and sheep, right? So he will take these simple, innocuous things that nobody's ever thought about in this manner. But because the dominant narrative, the common culture has become vegan, from this person's perspective, all of this becomes so evil and barbaric. And he's quoting legitimate verses, legitimate ahadith, and he is now imbuing them with an evil and a dread and a symbolism that was simply absent and is absent in the minds of all of us and is absent in anybody's mind unless they happen to be born in the United Kingdom of Veganopolis. And then the more experts amongst them will be able to quote fiqhi positions that are frankly unknown or bizarre to most Muslims. They've never heard of them. But they'll find these fiqh positions in the books of law. Now they might be legitimately quoting from the books of law, but these positions are not lived in Islamic societies. Somebody might have said them 1,000 years ago. And he will say, for example, that, oh, Muslims are so barbaric. Do you know that the Hanbali madhab, one of their schools of law, it allows the eating of coyotes and foxes? Now this is, any fiqhi position I say is legitimate. I'm just giving an example, but the fiqhi positions are legitimate. Forget cows and sheep. This madhab allows coyotes and foxes. And you know what? The scholars of hadith, their tradition, they even allowed the eating of a desert lizard, the dab. It's allowed in the Sharia according to many of the scholars of hadith. And in fact, there's even this madhab, the Maliki madhab. You know what the Maliki madhab says he would champion? The Maliki madhab even says you can eat cats and dogs. It's not haram to do so. Now this is a legitimate position that is found in the Maliki school of law. And he says there are even scholars out there that have legitimized eating everything other than pig and whatnot, so they can eat rats and snakes and lizards and scorpions. Now, there are some scholars in our history that have said this, but these positions, who's ever heard of them? Who lives by them? Nobody. But he'll find those positions, and he'll publicize them on the media networks, and he will smear the entire faith based upon those positions. So this person will say, after reading their holy book, and after looking at their holy prophet, and after looking at their books of law, clearly the religion of Islam is a barbaric, uncivilized, backward religion because it is propagating disgusting practices such as the slaughter of animals. It is regressive. This is an affront to civilized behavior, and I cannot believe any sane, intelligent person can actually believe that this religion is true and valid, because this religion is telling us to slaughter animals and kill them and murder them simply to eat their meat. So this person basically leaves the faith. This is the first of, how many am I going to do in this talk? 5, very good, okay. I haven't lost you yet. The second trend are those who seek to assimilate while they retain their Islamic identity, okay? So the first group are assimilationists who rejected the Islamic identity. The second group are assimilationists who want to retain their Islamic identity. And so this group believes the dominant social narrative that veganism is the only morally permissible and acceptable code of law. Yet at the same time, they choose to identify with Islam and openly say they are believers in the Quran and in the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. How can they do that when the Quran so clearly allows the eating of meat, and they have come to the conclusion that eating meat is barbaric and backward and uncivilized? How then can they believe in the Quran and in the Prophet ﷺ and still be Muslim? Well, this group, this is the second of the 5, are forced to superimpose by any hermeneutical or revisionist tool at their disposal. They're forced to superimpose their own ideology and ethics onto the Quran, onto the corpus of Islamic tradition. And this group typically dismisses hadith anyway. They don't believe in hadith at all. They'll say hadith has not been preserved. We only have to worry about the Quran. So they will say, for example, that, well, it is true that some scholars of the past have interpreted the Quran to be encouraging the eating of meat. But if you look at the spirit of Islam, if you look at the goals of the Sharia, they will say, the Sharia came to eliminate the eating of meat. The Sharia intended to, but the Sharia came down and the people were all involved in eating meat. So it couldn't prohibit it immediately. So what did it do then? It aimed at it and it hinted at it without actually getting there. It allowed us the tools to understand that eating meat is backward. And so in our times, now that we are living in whatever the year they're living in this United Kingdom of Veganopolis, then we say Islamic law mandates upon us that we should be vegans and that it is haram to eat meat. And they say, if you look at some of the traditions of the Prophet ﷺ, now even though generally they deny hadith, they will cherry pick the 1-2 hadith that they want to read into. They will say, for example, that it is clear from the seerah that our Prophet ﷺ rarely ate meat. Is that true or not? He rarely ate meat. This is true. It is clear from the seerah, they will say that Aisha, his wife, quoted that 3 months would go by without a fire being lit, meaning no meat being cooked. So they would say, they're reading in their dispositions into the seerah. They would say, one can say in essence that the Prophet was a vegan. Now this is them speaking again, right? The spirit of Islam was to be vegan. And yes, just to conform with the people of his time, once in a while he might have done so. But the norm or the regular rule is that you should be vegan. And they would say, there are so many traditions that our Prophet ﷺ was sent to be kind to the world. Rahmatan lil alameen. And so here's another tactic. They take generalities and they use it to trump specifics. They take generalities. So we know from the Quran that he's Rahmatan lil alameen. We know from 1 or 2 hadith that an animal complained that he's being mistreated. And the animal came to the Prophet, and the hadith is in Bukhari, by the way. The animal came to the Prophet complaining that my master overworks me and underfeeds me. In another hadith, it is mentioned the animal complained, my master beats me. And the Prophet rebuked the owner. Now, these are all authentic hadith. So, this second paradigm person will say, this person who's an assimilationist while being a Muslim will say, can you imagine the one who's rahmatan lil alameen, the one who told the owner not to beat the camel, not to overwork the camel. Can you imagine him telling his followers to become bloodthirsty on the day of Eid and kill all of the animals in their possession? Is this the Islam that the Prophet came with? And of course, an average Muslim who is not familiar with the text of the Quran and Sunnah, you've quoted him a generality, you've quoted him a specific incident, you've extrapolated a rule. And that rule is, how could the merciful Prophet tell his followers to slaughter sheep on Eid? Clearly this is wrong, because he's rahmatan lil alameen. So this is a mistake. There's no such thing as slaughtering Eid. We are Muslims who are vegans, and this is what Islam is all about. And therefore, one of the tactics of this group is to pick and choose texts to conform with their standards, and then to read in those standards into the Quran and Sunnah, to literally force the Quran to say what it wants them to say, rather than letting the Quran speak for itself. This is the second group out of 5. The third group, let's call them traditionalists. This third group represented the majority of mosques, the majority of practicing Muslims of this land. And this group attempted to codify and preserve the meat-eating heritage of their forefathers and ancestors. So for some of these groups, because the dominant culture forbade eating meat for this group became one of the essentials to be a Muslim. You have to eat meat to be a good Muslim. In fact, if any Muslim chose not to eat meat, even for personal reasons, they viewed this Muslim with disdain. Oh, you have lost your soul. You are now part of the dominant culture because you're not eating the meat that our forefathers used to eat. And so eating meat became more of a ritual for these Muslims than it is even in Muslim majority lands. And a sign of being a practicing Muslim was to eat meat, because it was counterproductive to what the dominant culture, which was a non-Muslim culture, was saying. And therefore, any gathering of these conservative or traditionalist Muslims you went to was clearly symbolized or was marked by their meat-eating habits. And within this traditionalist trend, there were many spectrums. Within this traditionalist trend, there were many spectrums depending on where their ancestors came from. One group amongst them insisted on biryani. Others wanted shawarmas. Yet another group said it has to be boiled rice and lamb with nuts and raisins. And you had yet another saying it must be chicken with couscous. Yet all of them frowned upon eating fish and chips, which was viewed as being dominant of UKV. They were vegans, but fish was allowed. So let's put it that way, okay? The dominant culture were vegans for I just improvised right there. So they all looked down at fish and chips. Why? Because our forefathers did not eat fish and chips. It must be biryani, or if they were from another group, ruz dajaj. From the third group, shawarma. But it could never be the fish and chips, because then you sold yourself to the devil. Now, these specific cuisines became extremely important for each of these sub-trends. And in fact, it defined them vis-a-vis the other traditionalist groups. It defined them, and they made a very big deal of this. We might think this is trivial. They made a very big deal. If you chose biryani over the shawarma, they would fight you. They would refute you. They would pray in separate masjids as you. Because this is not the version of Islam that their forefathers were upon. And so each one of these ossified, solidified the culture that they happened to come with and make it the only manifestation of Islam. And they made the eating of meat perhaps the most or one of the most significant factors of judging your level of Islam. And in fact, it's quite clear that this third trend was a counter-reaction to the popular culture. And in fact, this was demonstrated even in the attitude that they had towards the dominant culture. Even though their children were born here, maybe even they were born, many amongst them did not view themselves as being a part of, even citizens of the United Kingdom of the Vegaноpolis. Others, they had to live their lives in two binary spheres. They would walk out of their sphere when they worked, when they went shopping, but in their social gatherings, their cultures, their norms were completely separate. It was as if, quite literally, they're living within a bubble. And one of the things that they were worried about is that the majority of their children and their grandchildren decided they couldn't live in that bubble anymore. So yes, their conferences and their masajid were packed, but typically with older people. And their children and grandchildren, by and large, were not passing on this tradition, and that was something that definitely they realized that this was a problem, and they did not have a solution for this problem. So this is the third group. We will call them traditionalists. The fourth group, let's call them the radicalists. These were small groups of people, very small in number, who became so enraged at the type of rhetoric that the broader society used against the Muslims, and the sanctions that UKV was doing against Muslim majority lands, the foreign policy, the unjust wars, the invasions in order to spread veganism in other Muslim lands. They became so angry that they began to commit vigilante acts, destroying vegetable farms, burning vegetables in public as a sign of contempt for the dominant culture, and having a very much us versus them mentality. And of course, the news media loved to concentrate on these people. We might not have ever met them in our lives, but the news media loved to portray all Muslims to be like this small, fringe, radicalist culture. And this is a fourth trend that is very logical to imagine in this society. The fifth and final trend, before we backtrack, and you all understand where I'm heading with this, inshallah. The fifth and final trend, and the term is problematic to use because it's already imbued with things that are not necessarily positive or negative, but I'm going to use it anyway because I can't think of a better term. And of course, this is the paradigm that I feel the most sympathy towards, but we'll come back to this point as well. Let's call them the reformists, but the term is irrelevant. It's what you do with it, right? Let's call them the reformists. This group was different from all of the preceding four. They wanted to historicize both the dominant culture of United Kingdom of Veganopolis and specific interpretations of Islamic law codified by the traditionalists. In other words, they wanted to ask two separate questions. Firstly, how and why is veganism so popular? And what is so good about veganism? Is it really all evil? Is it really all good? Is there anything good we can take? Anything bad we need to reject? And secondly, does Islam have a specific answer to veganism? Or is this something we will have to think about in modern times? Because they understand very clearly, this group, that veganism did not exist in pre-modernity. And therefore, the classical tradition of Islam was silent on the issue of veganism as a phenomenon because scholars of the past never lived in a veganistic land. They never experienced the types of motifs and the types of ethics that were dominant in the United Kingdom of Veganopolis. So these people, the fifth category, the reformists, they were not dismissive of the Islamic tradition, unlike the second camp. The second camp rejected the Islamic tradition. The second camp are Muslim, but they don't care what Islamic law said of the last 14 centuries. This group was not dismissive, but they said the classical tradition has not spoken about modern issues. With all respect to them, it does not give us the exact answers we need for modern problems. And therefore, we need to build, not dismiss, not get rid of the class, we need to extrapolate. We need to pull out from the classical tradition using modern scholarship, modern ulama, to formulate positions about veganism in light of the circumstances that we are living in. And they were also willing to explore, to question the possibility of the positives of being a vegan. Is there anything un-Islamic about being a vegan? Can we be a good Muslim and a vegan just because the UKV is vegan? Does it automatically make it evil? Just because it didn't emanate in Muslim majority lands, is there anything positive that can be taken? So they're willing to ask these questions. Unlike all of the previous categories, the first and second category, they took the modern values as a given. You don't question them. The third and fourth categories were both counter-reactionary. They took these modern values as inherently being evil. You don't even question their validity. To merely question their validity, you become evil. The fifth category is saying, no, we have to question both. What do we question? We question the dominant narrative, in our case veganism, and we also question not the Quran and Sunnah, which is what the second category did. We question the classical understanding. And especially, we question the codified Islam of the traditionalist scholars. Yes, indeed, it is true that the bulk of Islam was eating meat. Yes, it is true that there are societies that are more pro-biryani and others that are pro-shawarma. But is biryani or shawarma in and of itself what Islam tells us to do? What do the texts tell us to do? And they're beginning to question. And questioning, of course, makes it uncomfortable for all involved. So the point being that the reformists were not suffering from some type of complex that they said, oh, veganism is always better. No, they're not being counter-reactionary, nor are they being emotional. Rather, they understood that, and this was their response to veganism, that being a Muslim, you could be technically a vegan. And it does not affect your God consciousness. And I say this, forget the fable, I'll tell you this, and every scholar of Islamic law will agree, if a person chooses of his own accord that I don't want to eat meat, I just don't like eating meat, there's nothing wrong Islamically at all. And you cannot say this person is somehow inferior or less of a Muslim, right? Now if a person says eating meat is backward and how can Allah have allowed it, we will say this is a theological problem. No, you cannot cross that line. But if a person chooses, and suppose in UKV, right, it was difficult for them to eat meat. So they decided to become vegan knowing that Islam allows the eating of meat, but in this society, I can't eat meat, right? Such a person would live a fully Islamic life. Such a person would not be anyway watering Islam down simply because the modern culture does not allow them to eat meat. Because you don't have to eat meat to be a good Muslim. So, at some level, this fifth paradigm, the reformists, they agreed with the traditionalists in that the base ruling of Islam was that eating meat is halal. And at some level, they agreed with the progressives in that, you know what, there might be some positives about veganism. In fact, this group might even say that yes, there are some practices at abattoirs and at butcher shops that are very wrong in Islam. You shouldn't be killing animals in front of other animals. You shouldn't be mistreating the animals. You shouldn't be feeding them such and such. The religion of Islam does tell us there are certain laws about animals. Simply preaching those laws because of the dominant culture does not make them sellouts. Simply bringing what Islam says about, yes, one could argue that it is actually healthier to eat less meat, which is what the dominant culture of our time says, right? So if the fifth camp, the reformists, actually began to preach this, that you know what, Islamically, you're supposed to take care of yourself. And if we minimize our eating meat, and if we bring in more humane practices when it comes to the treatment of animals, right? This would be a type of reformist position, if you like. That is against the first four groups and coming out of, if you like, a different paradigm. Now, the reformists were never as popular as the traditionalists, but they were a part of this entire, if you like, spectrum of 5 different trends. Now, the end of the fable here. Let's go back and talk about, obviously, we're not talking about eating meat. Alhamdulillah, the Sharia allows us to eat meat. And honestly, for me, if there's no meat on the dinner table, there's no dinner on the table. So, Alhamdulillah, the Sharia allows us the eating of meat. It's not about meat, really. But as I said, by the way, don't be so dismissive of the fable, because frankly, the way things are heading, I don't think it's too far-fetched to imagine a society somewhere in Europe, which has decided to adopt veganism. And yes, maybe these same issues will arise. Nonetheless, for now, as we speak in, mashallah, tabarakallah, November of 2014 at Imperial College, as we speak now, it's not the issues of veganism that we are talking about. Let's be very frank here. The issue is gender roles. The issue is the role of a man and a woman. The issue is sexuality. The issue is participating in a democracy. The issue is voting. The issue is how you dress. The issue is the applicability of the laws of Islam living here in England of 2014. And of course, we have all of these 5 trends. And I want to be very clear here. These 5 trends are not clear groups. They're a continuum. They're a spectrum. You can have symptoms of one and another at the same time. It's a spectrum, right? So I'm just giving you hallmarks, if you like, milestones. In a continuum of Muslims, there are some that might have a little bit of 1 and 2, a little bit of 2 and 3. Yes, that's a part of it. It's not as if it's a clearly demarcated group. But let's be modern about this fable. What am I talking about? The first group, the assimilationists who leave their faith. Who are these people? What do we call them? The assimilationists who reject their faith. The murtads, right? These are the murtads. And the murtads are those who basically The classic case of a murtad is to say, look at how outdated the Quran is. The Quran is not fit for modern times. That's what they would say. That the Quran is calling for corporal punishment. The Quran has very backward roles. Women get half the inheritance of men. And And he'll list everything that are the modern equivalents of veganism. Okay? And for him, there's no question. And here's the problem of the murtad, that the murtad has never even entertained the possibility that veganism itself might be a temporary human fad. Not something that is permanent and always. He would never question that, for example, in our case, gender roles. The role of genders has been pretty much given to be different for all of mankind's history, except in the last 50 years. Even in the last 30 years, to be more precise. This is a very modern phenomenon. The notion that genders have the exact same role in society. There should be no difference in their roles. Islam doesn't have that. And let's be honest here, it doesn't. Right? The issue of punishments. How does one punish a criminal? These are questions even lawyers and legal theorists to this day are debating. The fact that your country views capital punishment in a backward manner, well, America, as you know, where I'm from, right, they execute people all the time for petty things like drug and whatnot, things that are not, maybe not as bad as what the Sharia wants. The Sharia has very specific crimes that you're executed for. So it's not as if the jury has now come to a unanimous verdict across the globe that capital punishment is backward. But the problem with the murtad is there is no possibility in his mind that the dominant narrative might be wrong. That this person, either because of an inferiority complex, which is more commonly the case, they have an inferiority complex, or because this is the dominant culture, and so they just assume what is dominant has to be right, they internalize the rhetoric and the talk of the land to such an extent that they cannot see anything but the dominant narrative as being true. And so this person simply leaves the faith and says that, look, Islam does call for, let's say, the capital punishment. There's no way that I can be a Muslim. Islam does call for fiqh differences of men and women. Yes, it does. How can you deny that, right? If it's just in the laws of inheritance or the laws of marriage or whatnot, there are differences in the laws between men and women. So when your paradigm is that there should never be any difference, and this is what you're convinced about, then yes, Islam will not live up to your modern understanding. Okay, so this is the first group, and we have plenty of them. And yes, some of them become famous and write books and are interviewed on television. Yes, that happens as well. The second group was what we call assimilationists who didn't reject the tradition. And this is the phenomenon that is commonly called modernistic or progressive Islam. Modernistic or progressive Islam. And in essence, this group has the exact same problem as the first group. And that is that they're not going to question the dominant narrative. That the dominant narrative is a given. In our case, in their case, veganism. In our case, sexuality, let's say. Or, again, men and women. So they will say, for example, forget the classical tradition. Where in the Quran does it say a woman cannot lead a mixed congregation in Jum'ah Salah? We should be encouraging women to become imams in a mixed congregation. And this is a very progressive position, right? Or they will say, for example, that same-gender relationships are morally permissible. That yes, the masjid should sanction same-gender relationships. Yes, because the dominant narrative is saying that freedom of choice, so Islam as well should allow for this. And they say there's nothing in the Quran, which is of course false, because the Quran does have. But again, what are they supposed to do? Superimpose their values onto the Quran, right? That they, by hook or crook, by twist or whatever, they force the Quran in their own interpretation to speak what it wants them to speak. And of course, these people, generally speaking, are completely dismissive of hadith. They don't even care about hadith unless they talk about generalities to trump the specifics that they don't like. In that case, they will quote the hadith that they like. So this group, of course, I have very little sympathy for. And frankly, they really have issues with inferiority complex. Really, that's the fact of the matter. The people that are in this type of paradigm, they are not faithful to Islam. They're not faithful to the teachings of the religion. And one wonders, why are they so eager to be a part of Islam when Islam, and in fact, very frankly, the murtad, even though his kufr is more blatant, is actually more logical and rational than the progressive. Think about it. The murtad, and don't say that he's better. I didn't say that. I said he's more logical. Because the murtad says Islam calls for X. I don't like it, I'm not a Muslim. Well then, there's a simple logic that you can follow. Whereas the progressive, when Islam clearly calls for X, and all the Muslim scholars around the globe have always been calling for X, and it is now a standard established fact, he will come along and say, oh no, I have discovered the unique interpretation. I have now unlocked the keys to the secrets of, the inner dimension of the Quran. And I have a new fiqh or a new translation, which in essence makes him a new prophet, right? When he's coming with a new message, new prophet. And in essence, that is really what progressives are, putting themselves up to be. That they are completely rejecting. They don't care about fiqh. They don't care about hadith. They really just want the dominant perspective to conform. They want the Quran to conform with the dominant narrative. And honestly, I don't have respect for either the first or the second. Now the third, which is the conservative trend, and of course in our example, these were those who codified eating meat. They made it more ritualistic than even Islam ever said. This group, they have lots of positives and negatives, and frankly, this group represents the bulk of Islamic movements, the bulk of masjids in this country, and that's the fact of the matter. And I say this with respect, I'm not being derogatory at all, but the fact of the matter is that traditionalist Islam, by and large, have a huge fear of losing Islam in the second, third, fourth generation. They're scared, legitimately, everybody should be scared. They're scared of losing Islam, so how do they counter-react to that? They codify the only Islam they are familiar with. And they make that version of Islam the only legitimate manifestation of Islam. An Islam that is found back home, an Islam that they are culturally aware of. And they become popular, firstly because they're importing the dominant narratives. Biryani is popular in large parts of the world. Shawarma is popular in large parts of the world. That's how Muslims of those lands ate meat. So when they import biryani and shawarma to these lands, they feel this is a symbol of Islam. I'm being totally serious. I'm literally talking about symbols and values, and I'm going to be more specific in a while. They import a particular cultural narrative of Islam, and they make that to be the be-all and end-all of the religion of Islam. And therefore, to question eating biryani or eating shawarma becomes to question the religion itself. Because they have literally clung to an understanding of Islam that they found their forefathers upon. And the fact of the matter is that, yes, indeed, there's a lot of good in this, because there are lots of people that are eating this type of food. There are large Muslim majority countries that have this. And so when you join one of these traditionalist movements, you feel as if large parts of the world have this type of Islam. But the problem comes that because this group is counter-reactionary, because this group is simply acting out of a fear, the problem comes that many of the younger generation will find it more and more difficult, especially when the Quran and Sunnah does not teach a particular cuisine. They will find it more and more difficult to remain within this type of Islam, because this is an Islam, listen to me carefully here, that is not organically emanating from the texts, filtered through the reality of the culture of the Muslims of the United Kingdom of Vegaноpolis. And here is the point that the traditionalists fail to understand. That eating biryani became popular at a specific time and specific place in a specific culture. There's nothing inherently Islamic about that. And so if the Muslims of UKV do eat, let's say, fish and chips, this is in no way embracing the kufr that is also dominant in UKV. And there is no inherent symbolism in eating biryani over fish and chips or vice versa. Now, of course, the issue is not biryani and fish and chips. Frankly, in some cases it is, but realistically, that's not the main issue. There are issues such as, the simplest one that comes to mind is clothing. How does one dress? And forget even brothers and sisters, how does the clergy expect itself to dress? Every single movement of traditionalist Islam, how does the clergy in that movement dress? Frankly, they all dress according to the historical norms of a particular manifestation of Islam in a particular Muslim majority land in a particular century or era. And for them, this becomes religiosity. You understand what I'm saying here, right? So you go to one version of traditionalist Islam and you should wear the white kurta shalwar, let's say. And if you don't wear it, and I speak from experience, you will not give the khutbah. In another version of traditionalist Islam, you have to wear the thawb. In yet another version, it's got to be the jallabiyya. In yet a fourth, it's got to be this and that. And this is the narrative that they are completely familiar with. So that when somebody comes along and dresses differently, this person is automatically dismissed. That you can't possibly be a part of the scholarly community. Because they have not found their scholarly community being upon that paradigm. Yet, again, to be very practical and realistic, one could argue, and this is my opinion, and not just my opinion, but the opinion of many ulama, Ibn al-Qayyim is amongst them, that the sunnah, when it comes to dressing, is to accommodate the culture of your people as much as possible, as long as the Sharia allows you to do so. And that the Prophet ﷺ did not come with a fashion revolution. Think about it. No, I'm being dead serious here. He did not come with a fashion revolution. What was he wearing? Exactly what the pagans of Mecca were wearing. Exactly what Abu Jahl was wearing. Exactly what Utbah and Umayyah ibn Khalaf were wearing. Because that's the dominant culture of his times. So for somebody to come and codify one particular culture, the Prophet never saw the types of clothing that are common in many traditions. Even the thawb that we might think is the closest to the sunnah, you're really going to tell me this fine, fancy material with this fabric and this cufflinks and the perfectly tailored garment. You want to really follow the sunnah, go take some sheepskin and sew it together with rough, harsh wool. Right? Go do some real, and the garment is going to be totally, that's the sunnah. But that's not the sunnah that our Prophet wanted us to follow. He didn't tell us dress like this or dress like that. And the fact that, and again, another example is sisters' hijabs. The way that women historically in Indonesia and Malaysia wear the hijab is very different than the way that Nigerian sisters wear the hijab, which is very different than the way that that Moroccan sisters, or that Saudi sisters, or that Afghani sisters. So, for us to assume that the Saudi hijab is the only legitimate hijab, this is a mistake. There's nothing wrong with organically developing, wait for it, a British hijab. Because, and here's what I ask you, if it's halal for the Nigerian Muslims to have a Nigerian hijab, and it's halal for Indonesians, and for Moroccans, and for Pakistanis, and for whatnot, why then does it become haram when another culture of Muslims, which is all of us in this audience, try to do the same thing within our own cultural paradigm? And again, this is the difference between reformist and between, if you like, traditionalists, right? So the traditionalist Muslims, yes, they have a lot of good in them, and clearly they identify with observable symbols that have been associated with Islam. Wearing the kurta, wearing the thawb has become identifiable in large parts of the world as being a Muslim. So by putting it here, it makes them feel comfortable. But it's not necessarily, and in this case, it is not a part of the religion that Allah and His Messenger wanted everybody to follow. And there has been and there is leeway. Now, let me talk about the last one and then we go back to a little bit more examples. The reformists. The reformists are those who are sympathetic to the tradition. And they don't have any inferiority complex towards the dominant culture. They know that veganism is a temporary fad, that it was introduced 20 years ago and maybe 50 years from now is going to be gone. They have no inferiority complex. At the same time, they're not entirely dismissive of it either. Just because UKV is vegan doesn't mean veganism and all of its opinions and forms is invalid. Maybe there's some truth to it. Just because our forefathers weren't vegan, does that mean it's wrong? No, let's look at it. And they discover, you know what? It actually is healthier to have more fruits and vegetables in your diet. It actually is healthier to minimize eat. You know what? It's good to treat animals nicely. And yes, our religion tells us to sacrifice in a humane fashion. So they actually adopt elements of veganism. They adopt points of veganism that their forefathers did not do. And it's not found in the classical tradition, and they will say there's nothing wrong with fine-tuning for our culture. And the fact, of course, that the issue again of clothing and women's hijab comes up, that the reformists try to contextualize that each of your movements, they also contextualize traditionalist Islam. Why is wearing a kurta so important to you? Because in 1857, when the mutiny took place and there was a big divide amongst Indian Muslims, one of the ways to tell whether you're pro-British or anti-British was the clothing and the dress that you wore. So they made it a factor that you have to wear this clothing. Why is the thawb particular to you? So they historicize each movement and the positives and negatives of the movement. And this, of course, means that reformists, the last category, are unpopular amongst all the other groups because they're attacked from all sides. The traditionalists view them as being problematic because they're not faithful to the tradition. They're not faithful to the tradition as understood by the traditionalists. Is that clear? Right? When you criticize biryani, it becomes criticizing the sunnah. You understand this point? When you criticize wearing a thawb or kurta, which I do criticize, I say it is against the sunnah. Against the sunnah to make it a point to wear a shalwar kameez in London when you think that this is more Islamic. If you just want to wear it for your own culture, of course it's halal. But you want to wear it to make a point of being more Islamic? No, Islam is not in the kurta. Islam is not in the thawb. Rather, you are sticking out for no reason. And our Prophet wanted to conform as much as possible so that there's some familiarity with the culture, right? I give examples of this, that when our Prophet would receive delegations from other places, the hadith say he would dress up in a Yemeni cloak. Who told him that wearing a Yemeni cloak was dressing up for 7th century Arabia? Did he invent this? Or was this the norms of his time, that if you want to dress up, you wear a cloak from Yemen? Of course, the answer to that, it was the norm of his time. That dressing up means you put on the Yemeni cloak. You have that shawl, that's a beautiful shawl from Yemen, and this is considered dressing up. In our times, it's not dressing in a Yemeni cloak, it's dressing in a suit. This is dressing up. So when he's giving da'wah to the delegations, he'd dress up. What is giving da'wah in our times? How are you going to bring about? So you see, here's the point. The more different you are, then when you come with a different theology, you're dismissed as being different. Whereas when you speak the same language, why did Allah send every prophet with the same language? When you dress in the same clothes, when you are a part of the society. And that's what Allah says, وَإِلَىٰ عَادٍ أَخَاهُمْ هُودًا وَلِمَدْيَنَ أَخَاهُمْ شُعَيْبًا. Their brother Hud, their brother Shu'aib went to them. It's somebody they know, somebody they can be familiar with. Then you come with a different religion and you're not that exotic. And this, in my opinion, is the goals of Islam. So when I come along and I say, in fact, clerics, especially when they stand in front of non-Muslim audiences, should dress up according to the standards of our times. Yes, people will attack and they say, look at this guy. He's still dressing in pant and shirt. What type of scholar is this? Right? When I make it a point not to wear a topi, and I don't typically wear a topi, even when I'm bald after Hajj, I don't typically wear a topi. Because in my humble opinion, covering the head is something completely cultural. Our Prophet did it, he never commanded people to do it. There's no authentic hadith that he commanded people to do it. This was the cultural norms. Pagan, Muslim, they all covered their heads. Just like 100 years ago in England and in America, all people covered their heads. Didn't they? All men covered their heads. That was what people did. It's a cultural thing. If you want to dress like that, fine. If you don't, if you think it's Islamic, I think that's a problem in this land. Back home, that's another issue. So my point is that traditionalists view reformists with great trepidation, because they view reformists as being stepping stones to what? Stepping stones to what? Stepping stones to becoming modernist and progressive. If you're going to allow suit and tie, what next? Same-sex marriage? So from suit tie, immediately you jump there. Okay? But this is a fear that traditionalists have. You are laughing at this. I swear by Allah, I have to face this. I am asked these types of questions, right? When you allow certain things that they have been culturally, told is haram, haram, haram. When you begin to allow it, so you are crumbling their version of Islam, the traditionalist version of Islam. So yes, there is a legitimate fear. Oh my God, what is going to happen next? Where are you heading with this stuff, right? And so frankly, there is a fear factor of the unknown. Where are you going? Because, here's the point, traditionalists have a solid paradigm. That's back home Islam. Progressives have a solid paradigm. That's the dominant Western culture, right? Reformists are creating a new paradigm. And that's the scary part. They don't have something to fall back on. They are creating a new model because of new circumstances and new situation because of the time and the places that they are living in. And therefore, reformists do gain a lot of criticism from the traditionalists, and of course the progressives are dismissive of them too, because from the progressive paradigm, they are not progressive enough, that they still cling to the text of the Quran and the Sunnah. And again, I gave examples of clothing, I gave examples of whatnot. I mean, there are many other examples to give. Maybe in the Q&A we can elaborate more on this issue. But again, simplistic examples where I think that the traditionalists, with all respect to them, got it wrong. And that is, I think, one of the most intriguing examples in our last year or so was a series that was done on the Middle Eastern Broadcasting Corporation, MBC, on the life and times of Umar ibn al-Khattab, radiyallahu ta'ala an. The series is a 30-part series about the life of Umar ibn al-Khattab. And it was done with a team of world caliber ulama. The first time that I know of that one of the largest satellite companies in the Middle East, MBC, actually contacted reputable ulama, Sheikh Salman al-Auda, Sheikh Ali Salabi, I forgot the other name, but these are historians, ulama, that have specialized in the seerah and specialized in history. And they said, vet our dialogues for us, vet our facts for us. And they spent tens of millions of dollars doing a professional depiction of the life of Umar ibn al-Khattab, beginning to end, okay? Now, when the series was released, or the news of its release was said to the public, every single traditionalist scholar camp in the world was opposed to it. From the Salafis, to the Deobandis, to the Sufis, to the... everybody was opposed to it. Al-Azhar and the Saudi scholars, rarely do they come together. In this issue, they all agreed. And they said, no, you cannot depict this, it is haram. And they gave a long list. And much in that list is valid. I mean, I kind of sympathize with it. And they are comfortable. They said, how could you do what nobody has ever done? And you're imitating the companions and whatnot. And the fact of the matter is that, and I challenge anybody in this room to watch a few of those episodes and not tear up. Not have your iman just shoot out. Ya akhi, with all respect, I am a scholar of this issue of the seerah. I know these dialogues inside out. Wallahi, my wife got irritated at me when I'm watching. I'm quoting the dialogue back, and she's like, "Would you just be quiet when I watch?" You know, like I'm quoting in front. I know the dialogue. Yet to see it visualized, the emotions. You know what's happening? I'm tearing up. I'm feeling that boost of iman, and I know this stuff. Can you imagine the average Muslim is watching every episode imaginable? Everything that comes out, they're rushing to the studios and the theaters, right? Who amongst us in this room, don't raise your hand, did not watch, what is it, the Batman, what is it, Return of the Night, what is it? My point there. Who amongst us did not watch that, or the Lord of the Rings, right? Or the Hobbit. These are things, it's a part of our culture now, right? And the fact of the matter is, when you have 99.9999% of the ummah watching every filth imaginable, and they're not reading books of Umar ibn al-Khattab, then this is where the reformists come in and say, guys, for the greater good of these people, we need to do a series about Umar ibn al-Khattab. And they have their list of, for example, the reformists would have a red line. Me personally, that red line is showing the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. To me, that's the red line. We do not, and we have explicit ahadith that our Prophet ﷺ said, shaitan cannot imitate my figure. So this hadith shows us to anybody to imitate the figure of the Prophet ﷺ is haram, right? So we do not have an actor portraying our Prophet ﷺ. To me, that is the red line. As long as that line is not crossed, right? And overall it is a good, permissible movie, and I'm not saying that everything about the Umar series is valid, but I'm saying the good far outweighed the bad. And this is wallahi a fact that anybody with an ounce of common sense will see. The good by a factor of 1,000,000 outweighed the bad. When people, it's not as if they had a choice between Umar and Salat al-Tahajjud. They had a choice between Umar and Citizen Khan. What is it, Mr. Khan? What is that? Mr. Khan, right? Citizen Khan? Huh? Community leader? That one? So this is the option here, right? Which one are you going to watch? Which one will be more beneficial for you to see? And here's where again the reformists come and they say, look, we need to look at modern times. This is the poetry that our Prophet ﷺ commanded Hassan ibn Thabit to do. In his time it was poetry, in our times it's media and the cinema. Poetry, in essence, Islam does not encourage it. The Quran is very clear. وَالشُّعَرَاءُ يَتَّبِعُهُمُ الْغَاوُونَ. Generally, poetry is not something that's very good, but there is a culture of poetry. You'd rather have good halal poetry and then spread it. So Allah made an exception. Yes, except for those who are good and do good poetry. Okay, so the reformist camp was willing to change not Islam, but the cultural understanding of Islam. Culturally, we have never represented the companions on stage. There was no drama done with, oh, you be Abu Bakr, you be Umar. No, we didn't do that, did we? Right? But does the Quran and Sunnah explicitly prohibit this? No. So the reformist camp will be a little bit more open to the idea of change for the positive good. And again, many other examples, some of them trivial. I mean, I've already gone on record for saying this, so I might as well say it here as well, that I am of the firm opinion that many of the things that we grew up hearing haram, haram, haram are not at all haram. Simple examples such as celebrating your personal birthdays or anniversaries. There's nothing un-Islamic at all about these types of activities. In fact, Islam, if anything, should encourage anniversaries, because anything that brings love between spouses is encouraged in Islam. Right? Brother, sorry, but you're going to have to memorize your anniversaries or else. So my point is that there's nothing, just because our great-grandfathers did not celebrate their anniversaries or birthdays, there's nothing inherently un-Islamic. And I've spoken in more fiqhi detail because, yes, people bring imitating the kuffar and Eids and whatnot. Yes, so this is the dominant cultural narrative. This is an interpretation of Islamic law. Listen to the other side, and I've spoken about it at length in other occasions. There's nothing in Islam that forbids these types of things. Yes, Christmas, this is a religious holiday. We cannot imitate. Diwali, yes, we cannot do that. Yes, because these are the festivals that are forbidden. We have our festival, but a private, personal celebration. The Sharia does not dictate. If it is halal, what you do, then it is halal. If you graduate, you want to throw a party, does the Sharia say it's haram? Even if you make it an annual party, whatever, does this? No. There's nothing in the Sharia that dictates this. And again, you have this divide between. Another simple issue. And again, this is a little bit controversial, but inshallah, I mean, this is the whole point. This talk should make us think, and whether you agree or disagree with me, let the conversation begin. Another standard issue which is extremely contentious in our times, what do Muslims say about same-sex relationships, right? You have the progressive camp. The progressive camp will say green light, no problem, okay? Khalas, go for it. We should sanction it, correct? Right? The traditionalist camp will have the same rhetoric that they're used to hearing from back home. And they'll get themselves into a lot of trouble, and their speakers are banned these days from coming to your country, right? Because they're on record for having said things that, now listen to me carefully, I really believe don't need to be said at all Islamically. Islamically. Do we agree with same-sex relations? No. Does that mean we have to be nasty and mean and cruel to people of this orientation in this land? No. This is their land. They want to do it. Morally, we are not happy with this. But politically and legally, that's their business. And also, if we come across a Muslim who is struggling with this, traditional Islam, by and large, would be very, as you know, unsympathetic and harsh. Get out of our masjid, we have nothing to do with you. I would say, if this is a Muslim who's struggling with this issue, and wants to be a better Muslim. In other words, he's not justifying it like the progressives. He's not saying, oh, this is halal, why are you telling me it's haram? And I should have a public ceremony in the masjid. Right? If he's not saying that, and he's saying, look, I can't help it, whatever he says, I'm born this, whatever he says, I'm born this way or whatever, but the point is he admits, I know it's an issue, but I'm struggling with it. Then why should we treat him any differently than a person who drinks alcohol? Than a person who's struggling with drugs? Are you going to quiz everybody when they come to the masjid, have you ever drank alcohol? Have you ever taken drugs? Or if you know somebody drinks, you've seen him at the pub, getting drunk the 2 nights there, now he's at Jumu'ah. Are you going to stand, brother, this guy drinks at the local pub? Are you going to make a scene? wallahi, you and I will say, Alhamdulillah, at least he comes for Jum'ah. Right? Right? So why can't we understand the same and be sympathetic to somebody who's also struggling with the problem? Have I changed Islamic law here? No. I'm not saying we should sanction it. I'm not saying we codify it and have a celebration and feast and kill the lamb and slaughter the goat and go back to the vegan issue. No, I'm not saying that. But at the same time, I'm saying, has the dominant narrative forced us to maybe rethink through how we're treating such people? Yes. Yes, it has. Wallahi, it has. What's wrong with that? Can't we be sympathetic with a Muslim who might have different problems than I do? I might not have those problems, but can't I sympathize with his struggle? Do I have to be mean and nasty? Do I have to cut him off and tell him this and that? No. Just like every other sinful Muslim, we tell him, brother, Allah forgives all sins. Allah forgives all sins. Come to the masjid, read Quran more. And if you're still struggling, don't tell us these sins between you and Allah. Don't tell us, don't publicize. And repent to Allah and be a good Muslim and whatnot. This is the discourse that we should give. You understand what I'm saying here, right? That we're not changing Islamic law. Or I should say, we're not changing what is Islamic law. We might be changing current interpretations of Islamic law, right? And this is really what I think the 5 examples illustrate. And before I conclude, some guidelines for reform. I mean, in the end of the day, the talk was about what are the role and what is the extent of reform in Islam, some overall guidelines. So I have 5, if you like, points to keep in mind as we talk about the guidelines for Islamic reform. Point number 1, realize that these 5 trends have always existed in Islam. Always. Nothing new. The issues might be new. It's not veganism, but it is same sex. It is gender roles. 1,000 years ago, the issue was Allah's names and attributes. And are we going to take the dominant Greek culture or interpret it or take the Quran and Sunnah literally? But the issues might change. But how people have responded, the continuum, the spectrum of human imagination is limited. The game remains the same. The pieces change. The rules are the same. It's just what exact pieces are you using. So these 5 trends that I spoke about are nothing new. They have always existed from the very beginning of the prophetic era up until our times. This doesn't mean all 5 are right. Very frankly, I have no respect for the murtads and the progressives. I actually feel, I look down at the progressives. I genuinely think these people, they are pseudo-smart. They think they're very intellectual. They're not very intellectual. I have a lot of respect for traditionalist Islam. A decade ago, I would self-identify as a part of that spectrum of paradigm. And I think that's a very healthy part of Islam. And I love for them to be there and have their masajid, except that I ask them with all respect and kindness that your version of Islam might not be possible for your grandchildren to live it. And there's nothing wrong with taking elements of the dominant culture, elements, and incorporating them so that Islam becomes easier for your children and your grandchildren to live. So the point is, the first point, these 5 trends, and even more. I mean, again, I didn't talk about parties that are political in nature, you know, Hizb ut-Tahrir and Ikhwan, for example, and they want to bring about vegan laws, abolishment. I didn't talk about that paradigm. The point is, it's understood. These paradigms will exist. Nothing new about it. The second point, it is the job of trained ulama to weigh each and every issue in light of the Quran and Sunnah and in light of modern history. It is not the job of the lay Muslim. I want to be as explicit as possible because, again, one of the criticisms that I've received from many ulama that I respect and admire is that, Yasir, you are calling for the average Muslim to become a mujtahid. Nothing could be further from the truth, and I want to be as explicit as the English language allows me to be. Whose job is it to weigh through each and every issue, whether it's clothing, whether it's birthdays, whether it's voting, whose job is it? It is the job of trained ulama, clerics, those who have studied the tradition. So then why am I talking to you about this? Just why I would talk to you about what are the various madhahib of Islam, the Hanafi, Shafi'i, so that you have a better understanding. So that you have a better understanding, you understand why there's a spectrum of opinion. It is not the job of an average Muslim or somebody who attends one lecture or somebody who attends a weekend seminar, even multiple weekend seminars, to become an alim. Those seminars, these lectures are simply for Public education. It makes you understand more. It makes you better educated. As inshallah, I hope all of you, after even this one lecture, you're a little bit more in tune to what's going on. That's all it is, right? And therefore, this leads me to my third point, that scholars will always differ. There's not going to be a uniformity of opinion. Classic example of the Umar series. When these 6 scholars, and all of them were really great people, 2 or 3 of them I have a personal relationship with, I genuinely admire. When these 6 scholars signed on to the Umar series, and they approved, and their names came on the last list of credits, scholars around the globe criticized them. How dare you? And it became very difficult. And 1 or 2 of them almost buckled under pressure and kind of just withdrew from the whole controversy. And they said, we didn't realize and this and that. And it's difficult. So my point being, scholars are going to differ, and especially between traditionalist and reform paradigms. And I want to be very explicit here. Please listen to this. Not every forward-thinking or liberal opinion is necessarily the correct one. Nor is every conservative opinion necessarily the backward one. No, quite the contrary. Sometimes the conservative opinion is indeed the better one, even for the reformist camp. And sometimes the forward-thinking is indeed the better one. So it's not as if every single change is positive. No, definitely those who are reforming are not saying that. I am definitely not saying that. So every issue, it is the ulama who will decide, and on every issue you will get a spectrum of opinions. Ulama have never been united in the history of Islam, except over that which is, and that's another point here, by the way. I didn't add it on this list, but if you want to add this, you can add this. Allah has preserved this religion through what the scholars unanimously agree upon. If the scholars have unanimously agreed, then really that is something you should pause at. But where there is spectrum of opinion, even if it's a minority, in this case we had 6 ulama who approved, and the standard mainstream Sunni fatwa committees disapproved of this movie series. But still, there was legitimate ikhtilaf. So then this leads me to my 4th point. Your job is not to become an alim unless you want to, then go study 10, 15, 20 years. Your job is to do what? To choose the alim that you feel has 2 conditions. Number 1, genuine sincerity and taqwa. And you do not know that for sure, but you kind of sense it. This is a person who fears Allah. This is a person who's not selling his fatwas for dollars. This is a person who has a conscience. And then number 2, he's qualified Islamically. Means he's trained with ulama and whatnot. And it's very simple. I mean, how would you choose a doctor? You choose a doctor that cares about you and is qualified, right? Same thing for the Sharia. I'm not a doctor. I'm a PhD doctor. My mother says you're not the real doctor. I'm not the doctor, okay? So I'm not the doctor. I'm the PhD doctor. I'm not a doctor. When I have to go and choose a doctor, I'm not a specialist in medicine. How do I choose the doctor? Based upon convenience? Based upon the cheapest? It's my life and my children's life at stake. Do you think I care that one doctor is 20 pounds more than the other? Of course not. You don't go shopping for convenient fatwas. Just because a doctor is 20 pounds cheaper and he's got a degree printed from Sheikh Google, you're not going to go to him. You will go to a doctor who's qualified and you feel genuinely cares about you. Isn't that the case? Right? So why can't you do the same for the Sharia? Even more so for the Sharia. You go to an alim who is qualified and trained and you feel he fears Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? So your job as lay Muslims, all of us, our ultimate ijtihad is in finding the mujtahid that we feel comfortable with. So that we can say on the Day of Judgment, oh Allah, I'm not a legal specialist, but this scholar that I followed, he said this is halal. And wallahi, if you are sincere and you chose a scholar that you genuinely thought is a scholar, then yes, you are scot-free. You are scot-free, because this is not, we're talking about the finer details of Islamic law. Yes, I say it, yes. You are scot-free, and you can say to Allah, oh Allah, I am not an alim, I trusted this alim. And this alim said this transaction is halal. This alim said this is haram. And I followed him. Not a problem. So what is your job then? Your job is to choose the religious authority that you feel most comfortable with. And generally, if you stick within traditionalist and reformist Islam, you will be totally fine. Obviously, there are no ulama in murtad Islam. There are no ulama in progressive Islam. Frankly, progressive does not also have ulama. And amongst the radicals, with all frankness, there is no alim in that jihadist camp, except he became famous after all of this rhetoric. There's not a single alim, not a single scholar who was famous before these events and then who joined those camps in our times. So frankly, they don't have bona fide, recognized scholarship. The only scholarship you find is really between what I would call traditionalist and reformist Islam. And therefore, the fifth and final point, my advice to all of you is to keep your criticisms and refutations of others to a complete minimum. In fact, eliminate it from your personal lives. If other Muslims are doing things that their scholars are saying is legitimate, then that's between them and Allah. All you can do is introduce them to another thought and another scholar and say, read this stuff. That's about it. But you as an average lay Muslim should not get involved in refutation and counter-refutation. There's always going to be a spectrum of opinion. And if you feel more comfortable with you and your family following a certain understanding of Islam, good for you. Alhamdulillah, fine. In the end of the day, Allah's not going to punish somebody for sincerely practicing a version of Islam that was a little bit more conservative or a little bit more liberal than what the Sharia allowed for them. If they were sincere, they had the niyyah that this is halal and this is the way forward, then Allah's mercy is vaster than any one trend, any one group, any one firqa, any one hizb, any one jama'ah. If your niyyah was to please Allah and to follow the messenger, then even if you made a few mistakes, you did something a little bit more liberal than the Sharia allows, or a little bit more harsh than the Sharia doesn't make haram, but you made it haram. Okay, the world will go on. Inshallah, your prayer, your salah, your zakah will forgive you, inshallah ta'ala. Have a more optimistic attitude. Muslims who disagree with your minor interpretations, your minutiae, are not going to hell just because they like shawarma rather than biryani. They're not. These are trivial differences as long as they have genuine taqwa of Allah. They genuinely want to worship Allah and want to respect the Prophet ﷺ. That is the main point of religiosity. And yes, that doesn't mean they're all right. That does not mean they're all right. But it does mean it's not your job to get involved in refutation, counter-refutation. Those who are interested, go to the ulama and they will debate amongst themselves. So to conclude, my dear brothers and sisters, the issue is not over, of course, veganism and eating meat. The issue is about what does it mean to be a British Muslim. In your case, in my case, a Western and American Muslim. But this is really what is at stake here. And the question comes, I mean, just like, you know, the turtle, when the turtle is going forward, right? When the turtle is moving forward, when the turtle is scared, what happens? He goes inside, he withdraws into his shell. And we understand that's good, that's healthy. In my humble opinion, a lot of the conservative movements are like this. And I understand this. It's scary. It is scary. You just want to withdraw to what you know. But my only point is to think about the fact, when you withdraw in, you are stagnated and stuck. You don't go anywhere. And eventually, if you want to reach safety and freedom, in our case, if you want your grandchildren, you know your culture will be gone. The language is going to be gone. Even you in this audience, how fluently do you speak the language of your ancestors? The language is already gone. So there's nothing wrong with a fresh look. Nothing wrong. And if in that fresh look you take some of the dominant narrative, as we have taken their language. I speak English better than I speak Urdu or Arabic. We all know there's nothing wrong with that. So then why would it be wrong to conform to the dominant narrative in areas where Islam does not have any say in the matter? And here's where, again, we need a little bit more bravery. I sympathize with traditionalist Islam. I sympathize. And at one point in my life, yes, that was what I was most comfortable with. But being active with our youth, being involved in preaching and teaching, it's kind of made me come a little bit out of my shell. And I do feel, for the sake of my children and their grandchildren after them, and your children, I think it is time that we got out of that shell. And you know what? We might get lost on the way because, yes, we don't have a constructed paradigm. I might turn left when I should have turned right. But the goal is when I make that mistake, inshallah, those behind me will see that mistake. And they will still move forward and out of danger and into safety. We're going to make mistakes. And traditionalist Islam has a valid point. You don't know where you're heading. That's a valid point because we haven't gotten there yet. But British Islam, and there's nothing wrong with the term, inherently those are, I know it's associated with movements and whatnot that are, I'm talking about you are all British and you're all Muslims. Right? There's nothing wrong with you being British and being Muslim. There can be a type of healthy synthesis, and how much that will be and where this will head, we are formulating that conversation. We are solidifying that dialogue even as we speak. In the end of the day, my dear brothers and sisters, we're living in different times and different places than our forefathers, and this necessitates a fresh look as we respect the tradition. As we understand the heritage that we're coming from is a vast, beautiful heritage, but that doesn't mean we have to embrace it en masse. We take that which is necessary to take, and we modify that which is allowed to be modified, and we discard what can be discarded. And this will be an ongoing conversation. This isn't just a full stop at the end. Rather, the ulama will continue to discuss and engage. You will continue to see more controversies over more videos on YouTube and more talks of this nature. And your job is to stick with your ulama, whom you trust in the eyes of Allah. And if you are sincere and you want to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and you do the best that you think you can do, then alhamdulillah, Allah's mercy will encompass all of us. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us righteous role models for all people around us. May He guide us to that which is true. May He guide us to be those who follow the straight path to Jannah. May He cause us to live as Muslims and to die as mu'mins and to be resurrected with the prophets and the shuhada. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. So, we've had an excellent lecture with the Shaykh, but we know why everyone came. It's because of the Q&A. So we'll begin with the first question. So the first question is from a brother. He says, Salam Shaykh, you've highlighted these 5 trains of thoughts. My question is, can you suggest ways in which to handle people who have these progressive paradigms, primarily if they are close family or friends?
So the issue of handling the progressives, in one sense, my gut instinct is that progressive Islam will never flourish. It will always be there as a minority movement, but it's never going to flourish. And that is because, alhamdulillah, Allah has promised to protect this religion. And the majority of the ummah, as our Prophet said, will be, Inna ummati ummatan marhuma. My ummah is an ummah Allah has blessed. And if you look at all of these fringe movements, they actually, they as the English saying goes, I mean, in America we say their bark is louder than their bite. Means they seem to have a bigger presence than they actually do. And so, I mean, how many mosques in the Western world, are permitting different types of marriages, if you get my question, How many mosques are publicizing this? It's hardly. You can count them on the fingers of one hand. Even though there's no law, there's nothing that would make it difficult for them. There is no threat in reality, against their lives. If they were to open a mosque, down the street, it's their business. No, and I would say it is haram for us to physically do anything. That's their business in this land. Yet, where are they? You don't see them. So, I believe progressive Islam will always be a minority. The average Muslim knows that, look, if you want to be a Muslim, you can't drink and say you're a good Muslim, You can't take drugs and say, oh, this is what Islam tells me to do. You can take drugs and say, I'm a bad Muslim. Okay, that's within the confines of Islam. Nobody's perfect. But you cannot legitimize blatant haram. And what progressive Muslims are doing is basically doing that. So, alhamdulillah, they're not a large part of Islam. How does one deal with them? I honestly believe that they have a psychological issue, and that is an inferiority complex, that they are willing to believe the dominant narrative without even questioning it. So in my humble opinion, I could be wrong, but it's more of a deconstruction of the dominant paradigm than it is talking about refuting basically what they're believing. That, if any of you who are studying humanities, you talk about Enlightenment, post-Enlightenment, modernism, postmodernism. If you understand postmodernism, and if you understand basically the notion that there is no moral compass that humans can use their minds on, and the only thing we have left really is the Quran and the Sunnah. That if we were to basically get rid of that, then in reality there is no morality whatsoever. Nothing is left. And we see 50 years ago what the world considered evil is now considered legitimate. right? We see in our own lifetimes, when I grew up in the 80s, how certain things were viewed to be taboo and whatnot. And now, if you dare criticize those things, you are the backward person. So things are changing so dramatically that anybody with really a little bit of critical thinking understands that unless you stick fast to the one thing that never changes, and that is the speech of Allah, then there are no anchors and barriers and everything becomes legit. So I think the best way to deal with these brothers and sisters is not necessarily by refuting or by talking about Allah says this and that. They don't really have iman in their hearts that much. So it's a two-pronged, if you like, attack. On the one hand, it's a deconstruction of basically, modern thought and philosophy, which is actually well done. People have done this for you. There are plenty of thinkers in modern academics, and it's called basically, one of the main fields is postmodernism or post-structuralism in engineering and the arts. Postmodernism, just Google that, read the Wikipedia entry, it'll give you some hints here and there. And if you really want to, you're going to have to go down this route on the one angle. On the other angle, you have to talk about inculcating iman in their hearts, which is through the Quran, through spirituality, through whatnot. So it's a two-pronged attack, that you deconstruct the predominant narrative, and then you build within them submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that look, Islam is a package deal. If you believe in Allah and you believe in the Quran, then the logical, rational thing to do is to submit to the book you believe comes from Allah, even if you don't understand every single law. But if you believe it to be from Allah, then you're going to have to submit to it. And I've spoken about this, and you can also see in my Doha debates that I gave many years ago, where one of the ladies was saying that yes, we should have two ladies get married in Islam. Why is that wrong? Who are you to tell me it's wrong? And we have a debate back and forth. You can see that's one of the progressive Muslims of our time. And I have a number of talks. I actually have a talk about progressive Islam, a number of articles as well, and inshallah more will come in the future. But last point, I don't think this is a major threat. That's what I'm trying to say. It's not something that will take thousands and thousands of our youth. Maybe 1%. Allah knows best.
Jazakallah Shaykh. So the next question is, are we in danger of self-censorship of legitimate traditional scholarly opinion in order to be politically or legally protective of our community's interests?
Are we in danger of self-censorship of legitimate traditional scholarly opinions in order to be politically protective of our community interests? I don't think we have a problem of self-censorship. Quite the contrary, I believe that most people say too much when they don't need to say. And I think that our problem is that we don't understand the dominant discourse and the narrative. We can get our point across without getting into trouble. And the best example in our times is our views on same-sex relationships. A number of prominent people have been barred for, in my humble opinion, not acting wisely. I haven't changed my views, but I have said them in a language that is very proper, and it should not be legal at all. That we have certain views of morality, what is morally permissible, what is morally impermissible. And we will not allow these moralities to be changed within our mosques and sanctioned within our marriages. We will not. But at the same time, we will not get involved in issues outside of the mosque. That if two people want to do something, then just like they go to the pub, and we're not asking for legislation against pub going, are we? So if they're doing something that we believe to be immoral, it's not our Islamic business to harm them, to mistreat them, okay, that's what they are doing. And here's the point. So I don't see this as self-censorship. I see this as wisening up. How do you phrase what you believe in a manner that, and even there's nothing wrong with this. What does Allah say in the Quran about idolatry? That don't curse the idols that they worship. Even though those idols, do we respect them? Do we believe in them even? No. But what does Allah say? وَلَا تَسُبُّ الَّذِينَ دُعُونَ مِن دُونِ اللَّهِ. Don't shatam and curse and use vulgar words. Why? Because what do you gain? The point is what? To make them think and reflect. And Allah told Musa alayhi salam, when you go to Fir'aun, then say the gentlest of words. فَقُولَ لَهُ قَوْلًا لَيِّنًا. Maybe those gentle words will jar him to think better. So in our times, it's not idolatry. I can speak about idolatry and your government couldn't care less. But if I spoke about this one controversial issue in a harsh language, this will be my last trip to England. It's a different dynamics, isn't it? Right? But if I phrase it in a language that I remain faithful, and I was interviewed by the Guardian and whatnot, they came to me wanting to do this. I said, what is your view about da da da? I said, look, in Islam, you cannot have an extramarital affair. That's something that they also agree with, right? That it's immoral to have an extramarital affair, and it's immoral to engage in premarital, and it's immoral to engage in same-sex. But we will not harm somebody if they engage in extramarital. We're not enforcing anything. And if we know of a Muslim like this, then he will come to our community. We will welcome him. We're not going to call for him to be physically harmed. And this is the position of mainstream many Christians and Jews. What are you going to say about that? I mean, you're not inciting hatred. You're simply saying we don't agree with this lifestyle, just like we don't agree with drinking and whatnot. So in my humble opinion, I think our representatives, political and ulama, legal and scholarly, need to wisen up. Learn how to speak in a manner that is befitting of the beautiful religion that Allah has given us. And in my humble opinion, this is the sunnah of our Prophet ﷺ that I find in the seerah. That he was firm, he didn't compromise. But there's a way, there's a language, there's a mechanism. You don't intentionally insult or off-put people. So rather than self-censorship, I actually think the exact opposite is true. That we need to begin a very frank dialogue that our ulama need to learn and our political representatives need to learn how to speak in the language of the sunnah. And Allah knows best.
The next question is about intergender relationships. Where do we draw the line? Traditionalists suggest a very preventative approach which sounds impractical. Could limits be subjective to our knowledge of our own strengths of limits in the confines of Sharia? So how do we go about intergender relationships in a professional environment? So for example, professional etiquette is to shake a woman's hand or to look them in the eye. But from Sharia we find contrary points. So how do we reconcile between the two?
There's no doubt this is one of the most difficult issues to navigate in the modern workforce. And those of you who are not yet in the workforce, don't presume that you know how you will act when you get to that arena. It's very easy to be hardcore in uni. It's very easy. But when you get to corporate world, when you get to the job situation, when you understand the dynamics, then things change a little bit. And the fact of the matter is that we are surrounded by areas that are difficult for us, such as this one. And this has resulted in, as I said, a counter-reaction to the dominant narrative, where, in my humble opinion, many of us counter-react within our Islamic settings even more strict than what Allah and His Messenger have intended for us, as a counter-reaction to the predominant narrative. It's as if any type of interaction with the opposite gender becomes totally haram, totally problematic. Even though we don't have a problem acting with the opposite gender in our classrooms, in our settings, look at your underground tube. How close are you to the other gender, right? Astaghfirullah, but sometimes I took your tube the other day. My God, I don't know how you guys do rush hour here. It's crazy. You literally pack like sardines and you don't choose the gender you're standing next to, isn't it, right? And yet, if a brother and a sister were to sit, I'm not saying it's halal, it's not technically, but if they were to sit over here together and they're not related, then that would be problematic. Now, the point is, how then do we reach a healthy compromise? This is an ongoing conversation. I don't have solutions. But what I do know is we do see extremes. On the one hand, in many of our ISOCs and masajid and whatnot, the segregation becomes so strict that our Sahaba and early generations never even conceived of such strict segregation. It becomes even stricter than the Prophet ﷺ and the companions themselves, right? And this is demonstrated in 1,000,001 ways. To have a physical barrier every time and whatnot. I am against this because that barrier is an imaginary one. It's only in your ISOC room. Soon as you walk out, it doesn't exist. So why create a false bubble? And frankly, let me again be very blunt here. One of our biggest problems when it comes to these intergender relationships amongst brothers and sisters is that because we are segregated so viciously within the circle of Islam, we don't learn how to actively and respectfully dialogue with the opposite gender. Whereas we do learn how to react with the opposite gender with non-Muslims. You all know, brothers and sisters, when a person of the opposite gender comes and says, hello, how are you doing? Good afternoon, good morning. You all know what to say, how to say it, be proper and respectful without being flirtatious. Isn't that correct, right? Yet, in the ISOCs and Islamic conventions and whatnot, if a hijabi says to a bearded guy, Assalamu alaikum, immediately, she proposing, is it marriage, is it this, is it that, you know? And this is a problem. Wallahi, it is a problem. It really, you cannot interact with the other, in this case, without sexualization. Why? Because we're the ones who have created. Now, do you really think the Sahaba and Sahabiyat were like that? Wallahi, if you read the seerah, it's very clear. They are saying salam to one another in a respectful manner. You know, they know their boundaries. But we're not teaching our youngsters this. And this is, in my opinion, one of the biggest legacies that's problematic of ultra-conservative Islam. That we become more strict than the Sharia wants. And when you become more strict than the Sharia wants, there will be consequences. We don't know how to treat, our brothers do not know how to treat our sisters with respect that they deserve. They completely ignore them, as if they don't exist. They're walking down together. If it's a non-Muslim colleague of yours, lady that you have, taken class with, oh, good afternoon, good morning. If it's the cashier, if it's the bus driver, you will say hello. Wallahi, doesn't your Muslim sister deserve more respect from you and say, Assalamu alaikum? She knows you're there for her without any flirtation. She knows, look, here's a brother in need. If anything happens, if any bad person comes, I know there's a brother in the vicinity. But no, we have been taught to completely ignore, as if she doesn't exist. And it's a two-way street as well. And wallahi, this is a problem. You read the seerah, you don't find this fanaticism that the two genders have absolutely opposite spheres they're living in. Now, this is in the seerah in Medina. Imagine in England when there is no segregation, when we bring about a false segregation, what's going to happen? Now, does this mean that, mashallah, tabarakallah, brothers and sisters just, have a party together? And no, of course I'm not saying that. And this is the problem, that when people like myself start speaking, the traditionalists, as I said, they start kind of getting a little bit worried. Where are you heading with this talk? And I understand that fear. But this is called in logic the floodgate argument. If I open the door an inch, I'm going to open it to, all the way. This is called the floodgate argument. And it's a very, very shallow, very facetious manner of refuting something. No, I am not saying we crossed the line. What is the line? Obviously, flirtation and haram relationships is the line. But if we don't teach our young men and women to respect one another, regardless of the gender, how then do we expect to have a positive society? We are not taught each other's names. It's haram to mention her name, right? She's just an anonymous sister. Even her name becomes taboo. I don't know how it is in your ISOC, but I'm saying, I know for a fact in other ISOCs, even the name becomes taboo. In the hadith in Bukhari, Zainab knocks on the door. Aisha says, Ya Rasulullah, it's Zainab knocking on the door. She says, it's Zainab. She doesn't say it is a sister. She says, it's Zainab. And then the Prophet says, which Zainab? Ayyu Zayanib. I know a lot of Zainabs. Which Zainab are you talking about? And so she says, Zainab, the so-and-so, the daughter of so-and-so. So what does this show us? I mean, honestly, we have an issue about becoming more strict than Islam wants us to be. And it's going to become a backlash. Then we have the other side where we don't care about, and this is the point. Every time you have a reaction, you're going to have a counter-reaction. Which is why I am so adamant that the way forward is by, inshallah, bringing a healthy, applicable understanding of Islam. So when it comes to gender interaction, it is almost impossible for us to lower the gaze 100% in a professional environment. So what does Allah say? فَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ مَا اسْتَطَعْتُمْ. Fear Allah as much as you can. So look in the direction, but don't stare at her body. Don't stare at her as an object of beauty, and act in a dignified manner. And every brother here knows how to act in a dignified manner when it comes to a non-Muslim lady. Act in a dignified, non-flirtatious manner. If she's wearing clothing that is very difficult for you to concentrate with, don't look at that portion of her body. Don't control your gaze at that level, right? That is more difficult, but that is also, you will show her that you're treating her like a human being. Wallahi, I know of a sister, I know this sister. She is now, mashallah, elderly sister. She converted almost 35 years ago. And her conversion to Islam was because a young gentleman from a Muslim land was visiting. She's not from Europe, she's not from England, she's from another country, was visiting, and she was a very beautiful, provocatively dressed sister. You know how they dress, right? And this young man would always treat her in a manner of dignity without, you know what I'm talking about, without being vulgar or flirtatious, always be dignified. And she was intrigued. Why is this man, my body is so beautiful, all the men stare, all the men comment. Why is he treating me with such dignity? And she asked the man. And the man said, I'm a Muslim, and we are taught to, not stare and not be, lascivious looks and whatnot. She was so impressed, she started studying Islam, and yes, she converted, and mashallah, she's a very active lady to this day. My point being that you need to understand, Allah says, don't stare at women. That's true. So then don't stare at them with lust and passion. But in the corporate environment that we are, I don't see a problem if you don't have that lust and passion, that you look at them without necessarily staring and tell them what needs to be told, and then treat them in a dignified manner. And there are evidences from the Sharia that can be used, and especially with regards to the other around, that women, Aisha staring at the people that were playing with spears in the masjid, and she's seeing them look at that, and the Prophet did not mind that she's staring at them and she's looking at what they're doing, because there's clearly no emotion or whatnot being involved. So فَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ مَا اسْتَطَعْتُمْ, fear Allah as much as you can while you conform to etiquette and manners. And as for shaking the hands, then I do discourage this. I don't think that this is something we should encourage. The least that can be said about this is that it is makruh, so we should discourage this thing and not open the door. But at the same time, if push comes to shove, if you do this, don't feel that you are the worst person in the world. Make up by giving some extra sadaqah. I'm not saying it's halal, don't misquote me. The least that can be said, it is makruh. I'm not saying it is halal. But if you do find yourself doing this, then ask Allah to forgive you. Make some extra charity. Don't feel as if, khalas, I'm the worst Muslim in the world. No, there are much bigger sins than this, and we're all struggling with our sins. Don't allow one sin to make you less active in other areas of Islam. And in the end of the day, Allah knows that you might be doing things you don't like in this land, but there are also positives you can do with this land that you cannot do in other lands. So weigh the good and the bad, and may Allah Azza wa Jalla make it easy for us to navigate through these difficult issues.
On to the next question, and it's a composite question, so I'll break it down. So you mentioned that a requirement for reform is to select an alim of your land to help guide us with the issues we are faced with in this time. Yet we find our alims to be far too traditional and not in touch with the issues of the ummah in our lands. What should we as ordinary Muslims do where there is a lack of alims with their finger on the pulse? We end up following imams from other lands, which also brings with it other issues. What do we do as ordinary Muslims in such a situation? And the second question that was similar to this asks that if all of our madrasas are based with a traditional mindset, then how can we go about finding leadership in Islamic reform when the traditional mindset is the status quo?
So realize that I am respectful of the traditional paradigm, and I said this very explicitly, that I understand exactly what they're doing. At some level it is natural to withdraw into the shell. Nobody should take away from this that be disrespectful of them. Rather, this is what has preserved Islam for so long, alhamdulillah. But all I'm saying is we need to move a little bit forward, fine-tune. And any type of reformation has to come from within traditional Islam, because they are the bulk and the majority. And again, I myself an example, I definitely was a part of that movement very clearly. Look at my older videos and I was wearing the thobe, yes, in my older videos you will see me with the topi and the thobe, and the mashallah, everything is different, so that's fine. We expect that some of the traditional ulama to go on beyond this, not a problem. And so those that don't, alhamdulillah, good for them. Nothing, we shouldn't at all, as I said, it makes complete sense, it's safety. Now here's my point though, I can criticize some ulama's mentalities by being backward thinking and not in touch with reality, and that perhaps has some legitimacy. But let me flip it around and let me ask you in this audience, why do you think so many of our ulama are not in touch with reality? Because most of us who are the intelligent, educated elite are not interested in becoming ulama. Our own colleagues and friends who graduated from top-notch grammar schools or whatever, right? How many of them went on to go to Darul Uloom or Azhar or Medina? All of us are doing, mashallah, tabarakallah, engineering, medicine, mathematics. We're at this prestigious university. Once upon a time, our best and brightest minds went into Islamic knowledge. Quite literally. And the fact of the matter is that in some Muslim lands these days, and I know of a particular country, I don't want to say it, but the government decides where you go. If you get above a 90, you go to medical school. If you get above an 80, you can go to engineering. If you go above 70, you can go to accounting. If you fail, you will go to the alim course. This is a fact. I am not making this up. And even if it's not codified in law, in many of our lands, it is codified by culture. Do you understand what I'm saying here? The creme de la creme of any society in the Middle East, in India, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, those that are educated at the top-notch schools, at the grammar academies, and whatnot, where do they go to study? America, England, Canada, Australia. So is it surprising then that those people who are the least connected with modernity and who then go to become ulama remain the least connected from modernity? It's a vicious loop, and every one of us is partially responsible for that. Now, I'm not saying you drop your career and become an alim, but I'm saying let us begin the conversation. If Allah Azza wa Jalla blesses you with 3 or 4 kids, encourage one of them. We need to start encouraging our ulama to come from within our own ranks. That means different socioeconomic backgrounds, different intellectual backgrounds, different people of variety need to come in. And if we're only going to get one particular type of person to go become an alim, what do you expect is going to come out? Okay? So, yes, this is a problem. I fully am cognizant of this problem. But the solution is not just by blaming and castigating them. The solution is to be more proactive. And for the next generation, every one of us, firstly, I always say, if you cannot become an alim, don't remain a jahil. If you cannot become an alim, don't remain a jahil. Learn something. Take some seminars, listen to these lectures. You might not become an alim, you will at least be a little bit more aware, a little bit more cognizant of what's going on. Try to be just like if you study some basic history courses, you might not become a historian, but you'll appreciate what's going on in the world. Study some political science. Similarly, you study a little bit of Islam, you might not become an alim, but you will begin to appreciate. You begin to recognize scholarship. You begin to recognize, other manifestations of Islamic thought. And therefore, it is a problem. I don't have an easy solution, but that's one of the reasons why I'm talking like this. That one of the criticisms against me is, why do you bring these topics? You confuse the people. And the response is, this is the only way that insha'Allah ta'ala we will bring the conversation forward. This is the only way there's going to be a genuine enthusiasm from within your ranks that your children become ulama, that you change the paradigm. In the meantime, you are saying, what do I do? Firstly, I think you're being very dismissive of all British scholarship. No, wallahi, I don't agree with this, that there's no ulama. Come on. I don't want to mention names because it is problematic. Why did you mention not him? But wallahi, there are people that I believe are more than qualified. They are part of your society. They have shown their scholarship, their credentials, their skills. And I always say we don't outsource our scholarship. Don't call Timbuktu for a fatwa. Don't call Saudi Arabia, Pakistan for a fatwa. Go to somebody who is a little bit in tune with modernity and lives amongst you so that they can understand some fatwa just do not apply in this land. And you will find people. So I don't agree with this dismissiveness that you're saying we don't have anybody, we have to go overseas. No, you guys have the highest concentration of ulama in Europe. Do you know this? In Europe and America, the highest concentration is in London, right here. The highest concentration. There are, even just in terms of Medina graduates, Azhar graduates, the most in the Western world in one city are in London. Because you guys attract everybody, mashallah, tabarakallah, right? So, Londonistan, they called it, right? So you guys attract everybody here. You have lots of people. Many of them are living amongst us here, but they don't really make it public that they are, scholarly trained or whatnot. Where there's a will, there's a way. Ask around, and you will find somebody. Secondly, in the long term, what can you do? Start thinking about changing the dynamics. Start thinking about, let me learn a little bit of Islam, don't remain a jahil, understand what is fiqh, what is theology, what is tafsir, so that I kind of get in tune with, again, see what's going on, and then inshallah bring about an ethos of academic Islam in my household, in my masjid. Then inshallah that will create a new generation that is more in tune. So slowly but surely, there's no quick magic solution. Slowly but surely, inshallah ta'ala, change will come.
Okay, so leading on from that question, there was a question from the emails. Somebody asked that Islamic education the most in need of reform from all aspects of Islam? Because this is where ulama will come out. And if the ulama are adequately trained and are competent, they will be able to deal with the troubles and difficulties facing the people.
I don't think it's the only place of reform. Definitely some reform needs to take place. There's a lot of good in Islamic seminaries. There's also some negatives. There's a lot of good in Western institutions. There's also negatives. And I mean, having studied at both, I have a degree in engineering, 10 years in Medina, a PhD in the humanities and religious studies at Yale. I might have been through quite a lot of different, 22 years of continuous university education. Believe me, it's not, the 2 masters, 2 bachelors, 3 masters, and a PhD. I mean, it just keeps on acquiring. So the point is that I've been through all of this, and I can see benefits in each system. And yes, one of the things that I'm very passionate about, one of the causes that I'm very passionate about, is to bring about a reform in Islamic education, to create a seminary here in the Western world where we train ulama to be a little bit more forward-thinking, a little bit more proactive in the political and media and even with their societies. So yes, reform does need to take place, but before that happens, every one of you has to reform your own vision of what your role in this country is. And I was just talking upstairs with a brother here, and that is, you're talking about ulama, okay, that's fine. How about you? What are you doing to bring about some positive change? What is your vision for your own life? What do you plan to do with your masjid, your community, your neighbors, your friends? That is reform at your level. And I think the first simplest point is to recognize you are a part of this culture and this land. There should not be this us versus them mentality. There is no utopia you can migrate and live away from. This is where you are, especially those who were born and raised here. There is no other land you will feel as comfortable in as this land. There's nothing wrong. Get over the guilt complex. Yes, there's a lot of foreign policy we're angry about. You are the best position to change it from within. Nobody can bring about the change from within. Public perception, whatever it might be, media, whatever it might be. And also, in terms of da'wah, the freedoms that you have here to call to Islam, don't just look at the negatives. This is another problem we have. Wallahi, one of the things I really complain about is that Muslims, they love conspiracy theories and they love blaming other people, right? This is a problem. We don't find it in the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. The Illuminati don't control the world. There's not a cabal in some hidden room that has strings on every one of you out there. No. Allah is Al-Qawi Al-Aziz. Allah is in charge of the creation, not anybody else. Yes, there are powerful entities, yes, but they became powerful not through black magic and waving of that, but because of money and influence and whatnot. And the truth always wins over that power, and we see it in the seerah of all the prophets of Islam, all of them, Musa and everybody, that truth eventually wins out over falsehood. So you have your job cut out for you. Don't blame others and there is a lot to be done here. Each one of you should bring about a reformation within your own lives. What is my vision for the future of myself, my family, my community? And it doesn't have to be global. Allah will not ask you, did you solve the Palestinian crisis single-handedly? But can you contribute positively to your masjid? Can you bring about a change in your own family environment? Make them a little bit more, praying and practicing and positive attitude? Can you bring about a change in your immediate circle of friends? If every Muslim had a good relationship with his or her neighbors, non-Muslim neighbors, what do you think that would bring about, right? If every Muslim had a positive impact on his or her colleagues at work, don't believe that the only way to benefit Islam is to become an alim. No, that's one great way, no doubt. But if the whole world were ulama, what would the rest of the world be? All of the Sahaba were not ulama. Abu Hurairah's specialty was not Khalid bin Walid. Khalid bin Walid was not a specialist in Quran and Hadith, right? Mu'adh bin Jabal, Uthman ibn Affan, he was known for helping finance. We needed the businessman. We needed Uthman ibn Affan, who was a businessman, a successful businessman. Without him, Allah blessed him to basically finance so many things. So my point is, every one of you has a role to play. Don't trivialize your role. Your role is unique just to you. I cannot influence the people you can influence. They're not here, sitting here. Your circle of friends, your colleagues, your co-workers, that's you. Nobody in the world can stand in your shoes. So you have a unique job cut out for you with your talents, your skills, your circle of influence, the enthusiasm Allah gave you. If every one of you did that, wallahi, the world would be a great place. And that's all you need to do. That do what you can to bring about that better society for yourself, for your family, for your colleagues and whatnot. And inshallah, on the day of judgment, you can stand in front of Allah and say, oh Allah, with whatever you gave me, I did the most I could. And with that, you could get Jannatul Firdaus. And that's the beauty of our religion.
Okay, Jazakallah Shaykh. I think this will be the last question. You said the more different you are, the more you will be dismissed. That is very true for brothers, but a sister wearing hijab, dressing modestly, or even wearing niqab, if one follows that opinion, are all against the dominant opinions of our time, and it will probably always be that way. How can we go about actively integrating that into British society?
So, I said very clearly that as long as the Sharia allows you to conform to the culture, you should conform to the culture. We obviously do not conform to going to pubs, even though it is the dominant narrative of this society. But we don't conform to it. The Sharia does not allow us to conform to it. So we have to draw the line there. Similarly, when it comes to a woman covering her hair, the Quran is explicit in this regard. It's not an interpretation of some medieval scholar. The Quran is very explicit. And if anybody denies this, in all honesty, they do not understand simple Arabic. Because Allah uses the word for the piece of cloth that covers the hair. وَلْيَضْرِبْنَ بِخُمُرِهِنَّ عَلَى جُيُوبِهِنَّ. And khumur or khimar is what we call the hijab. Khimar in classical Arabic is what we call the headscarf. And that's literally the item. So it's in the Quran. Therefore, the covering of a woman's awrah, and that includes the hair, is something that is unanimously agreed upon. And it is definitely, now another problem we have is we make this the end all and be all. And this is, as I said, one of the problems, if you like, of traditionalism, where covering the hijab, the head or the hijab or the beard for the brothers becomes the symbol in and of itself of being a good Muslim. And the fact of the matter is that most of us subconsciously imbibe this culture. That we will instantaneously judge a brother or a sister, quite literally, based upon these issues that are not of as essential importance. Let me be careful here. I'm not saying they're not important. They're not as essential as the salah itself. How many brothers might have beards, but they don't pray 5 times a day? How many sisters don't wear hijab, but they are better in their akhlaq? They don't backbite. They don't do this and that. And backbiting is a worse sin than not wearing the hijab. Backbiting is a worse sin than a sister not wearing the hijab. How many hijabi sisters backbite? Right? So the point is that we really do have a culture where we're judging other people's religiosity based on one issue. And what did I say? That issue might be permissible. Biryani is halal. But it doesn't make it the end all and be all of Islam. Wearing the hijab, please be very clear here. Wearing the hijab is indeed something that is wajib. Nobody misunderstand me. But when did Allah send down the obligation of hijab? In the end of the 5th year of the hijrah. After the salah, after the zakah, after the fasting of Ramadan, after the bulk of the laws of inheritance and marriage and divorce, one of the, if you like, final things revealed was the issue of the hijab. And even in the verse of hijab in Surah Al-Ahzab, what does Allah end the verse with? Wallahu Ghafurur Rahim. So in this culture and society that we're living in, if a sister is indeed struggling with this piece of cloth, my heart goes out to her. I am sympathetic for her struggle. I tell her, Allah wants you to wear it. I'm never going to change that bit. But I will tell her, you know what? Just because you don't wear the headscarf, don't feel that you cannot be an active Muslimah. This is another problem that we stigmatize. If you don't have a beard, brother, don't be involved with the eye sock. Subhanallah, you're cutting off doors of good. Now I understand if you're committing a major sin, I do understand how can he be the president of ISOC. Okay, I understand. But to be involved, are you going to have a checklist of sins and good deeds to be involved with the ISOC? No, every Muslim or Muslimah should be welcome to be involved with the ISOC. Now I understand the president should embody the values of Islam. That is understandable. Yes, the head members, that is understandable. But just to be involved in Charity Week, in fundraising, in Islamic awareness or whatnot, no, wallahi. Every Muslim or Muslimah should find a space in the ISOC, in the community, in the center. Whether they wear hijab or have beards or not. So you are right, sister, that wearing the hijab will indeed bring about that type of attention. And here is where we say the text is clear. We are not progressives. The text is clear, and we cannot just discard the text. But what type of hijab? What color of hijab? What is the style of the overall garment that you can wear? Here is where we tell our practicing Muslimah sisters who have a flair and a passion for arts and whatnot, go ahead and think about a hijab that is at once modest and also reflective of the culture of the dress code that we live in. So for example, and again, a simple example here, that our sisters in, let's say, Pakistan might have a very loose shalwar kameez with a large shawl on them, for example, right? Our sisters in Malaysia, mashallah, they have very colorful hijabs, right? They have these beautiful decorations. They're accustomed to it. Isn't that the case, right? Our sisters in Nigeria, you know, if you look at the Nigerian hijab, it's a very intricate design and pattern, and it's very modest. So why can't sisters here in England look at what is modest? Yes, it shouldn't be skin tight. We all understand that, you know. But the Sharia does not dictate the color of the hijab. The Sharia does not dictate the style or the cloth or the material. So maybe have a modest type of two-piece, if you like, you know, like a business suit for a woman that is loose. It has to be loose. It's not allowed to be tight. Something like this. And if she wants to wear a jilbab, this is better. But wearing of the jilbab is not by jilbab, I mean a garment above and beyond what she's wearing. In my opinion, this is not obligatory. This is encouraged, but it is not obligatory. And that is because the term jilbab, it does occur in the Quran, but if you look at the meaning of it linguistically, and this is in Lisan al-Arab of Ibn Mandur and other books of Arabic language, a jilbab is any large covering that she wears, and a large headscarf can constitute a jilbab. If you have a large headscarf, this can also constitute a jilbab. So it is better, and some of our sisters are wearing an actual garment or jilbab. That is good. Stay like that. But for those who are struggling, we encourage them. We say start with this and do whatever you can, and especially when it comes to the jilbab. And listen to me carefully and don't misquote me. A sister who wears a headscarf, but she wears tight jeans and a shirt, is farther from the hijab than a sister who wears a loose skirt and a loose blouse with her hair uncovered. And this is another mistake that we make. We don't understand what is hijab. Hijab has just become the headscarf. And I repeat what I said. Please don't misquote me. And this is being recorded, so if anybody misquotes, you can look at it. I'm not saying it's legitimate. I'm not saying it's halal. What did I say? A sister who does not cover the hair, but she wears a loose garment and loose blouse and a loose skirt, covering the limbs, is closer to the ideal of hijab than a sister, and this is unfortunately all too common, especially in America, and yes, even in England, where her hair is covered, but she's wearing skin-tight jeans and skin-tight shirt. What is the purpose then of covering the hair? In fact, as I said, the loose covering of the body is closer to the ideal hijab than covering the hair. So we tell such a sister who's struggling, look, go ahead, and this is where I talk about language of upgrading rather than downgrading. Okay? We tell the sister who's struggling with the hijab, go ahead and begin with covering the limbs and wearing loose. Inshallah, bit by bit, work your way up to covering the hair. And then inshallah, if you want to wear jilbab, that's great. It's not obligatory to do so. So we encourage our sisters. Wallahi, brothers, it's easy for you to be dismissive because you can blend with the crowd. Your beard, if you have one, yes, these days it's really hipster to be a bearded guy, right? It is the cool hipster look, right? In the 80s and 90s, it was not. But these days, you have the glasses, you have the beard, it's like really, you're the mashallah, the GQ guy there. So you can meld in. It's not a problem. You can meld in. Our sisters, mashallah, tabarakallah, they really do. I genuinely admire every hijabi that I see. That you are an ambassador and a representative of our faith. I can get away with what I'm doing. It's true. Somebody might recognize me to be Muslim, but in the end, my dress code is a little bit more in conformity with their norms. So every brother, wallahi, you should respect our sisters, even those that are not wearing it. It's a struggle. Don't be judgmental. You're not in that position. Don't be judgmental. If they're not dressed appropriately, let other sisters talk to them. It's not your job to pass verdicts on other sisters and feel anything in your heart and why isn't she doing this? It's not your job. The fact she's coming to the masjid, coming to the ISOC, she doesn't need to come. This is England, this is America, you don't need to come. The fact that she's coming however she's dressed, don't turn her away. This is the modern world we're living in. Don't turn her away. And if she's dressed inappropriately, leave it to the sisters to deal with. It's not your business to comment on her. Let the sisters deal with her, and sisters deal with her in a gentle manner. Rather than the new sister comes in to say, why are you dressed like this? Smile and say, Salaam alaikum, what's your name, sister? My name is Fatima, what's your name? You will eventually talk to her about the hijab. Maybe 5-10 times later. But how do you expect to get her heart when you're going to be harsh and cruel the very first instance? And this is all about changing our mentality, that we literally are worried about our survival. This is the stage we've reached. And to be harsh and cruel is never Islamic. Never. Especially when we are a minority and our youngsters are leaving the faith. Now is not the time to be harsh and ultra-Islamic. And this is something that, as I said, I feel very passionately about. So how do you compromise this issue? As I said, we will be clear. The covering of the hair for sisters is something that is mandated by the Quran. We cannot change that. But as I said, you can change the styles and the patterns and whatnot, as long as it is not tight and it is not overly provocative. And inshallah, the bulk of hijabs are not, gaudy and whatnot. So inshallah, all of this is legitimate. And this is where we ask our sisters to think about what can they do in terms of fashion, in terms of whatnot. Where when I say fashion, I don't mean conforming with Western values. I mean fashion that takes in the culture as much as possible while retaining the elements of the Sharia. And alhamdulillah, there are a number of designs that I've seen that I think are good in this regard. In the end of the day, though, sisters, there is more requirements on you in clothing than there are upon men, and therefore there is more reward for you because of your struggle than there is for us. May Allah Azza wa Jal give you that tawfiq and that ajr that you definitely deserve.
Ameen.
So that was the last question, and if Sheikh would like to finish with any concluding remarks, inshallah.
No specific concluding remarks other than the fact that we're living in difficult times. We're living in very, very traumatic times. So much is happening in the world globally, internationally, locally, in your own community. The government, its rhetoric is becoming increasingly scary about Muslims and whatnot. So now is not the time to go hide in a shell. Now is the time to think proactively, to be a Muslim and to be a proud Muslim, to think about how you can bring about a positive image for Islam in your family, in your circle, in your friends, in your community. And that's why I'm so passionate about this particular issue, that I think we do need to bring the conversation forward. And at the end of the day, success is sought from Allah alone. So make sure you have a strong relationship with Allah, because nothing will be successful unless you have a relationship with Him. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless us all. Jazakumullahu khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.